On the morning of October 7th, 1850, the residents of Deadwood Gulch awoke to find Margaret Davis missing from her family's cabin. What made this disappearance particularly unsettling was not simply that a young woman had vanished from the volatile mining settlement, but rather the timing of her absence. Just 3 days prior, her older brother Thomas had been found dead along the creek bed, a bullet wound to his chest and his gold pouch emptied. The man suspected of the killing, a drifter named Silas Hayes, had also disappeared that same October morning. The Davis family had arrived in the Black Hills during the early months of 1850, drawn like thousands of others by rumors of gold deposits in the remote creek beds. William Davis, a former blacksmith from Pennsylvania, had sold his workshop and loaded his family into a covered wagon, convinced that fortune awaited them in the Dakota Territory. His wife Martha brought their 3 children, Thomas, 22 years old and eager to prove himself in the goldfields, Margaret, 20 years old and reluctant to leave civilization behind, and young Samuel, barely 18 and wide-eyed with adventure. They established their claim along a bend in Deadwood Creek, where William and Thomas worked the sluice boxes from dawn until dusk. Martha tended to their modest cabin, while Margaret assisted with the cooking and mending. Samuel split his time between helping his father and brother and exploring the surrounding hills. The work was backbreaking, but by September they had accumulated enough gold dust to feel optimistic about their prospects. The settlement of Deadwood Gulch in 1850 bore little resemblance to the organized town it would later become. Roughly 200 miners had scattered their claims along the creek, living in tents, crude cabins, or simple lean-tos constructed from whatever timber they could fell. There was no formal law enforcement, no church, and no established businesses beyond a few enterprising individuals who sold supplies at inflated prices. Justice, when it occurred at all, was administered by whoever possessed the strongest will or the fastest gun. Into this chaotic environment came Silas Hayes sometime in late August. He claimed to hail from Missouri and spoke with the measured drawl common to men from that region. Hayes was perhaps 30 years old, of medium height but broad through the shoulders, with dark hair and pale blue eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. He staked a claim upstream from the Davis family and worked it alone, which was unusual in a place where most men partnered with at least one other person for both efficiency and protection. What drew attention to Hayes was not his solitary nature, but his apparent success. While other miners struggled to extract enough gold to cover their basic needs, Hayes seemed to produce a steady stream of dust and small nuggets. He paid for his supplies with gold that appeared unusually pure, and he never seemed concerned about running short of funds. Some whispered that he had discovered a particularly rich deposit. Others suggested darker explanations for his prosperity. Margaret Davis first encountered Silas Hayes on a Saturday afternoon in early September. She had walked to the creek to fill water buckets when she noticed him washing gravel in his sluice box. He looked up as she approached and tipped his hat politely. They exchanged brief pleasantries about the weather and the challenges of life in the gulch. Margaret later told her mother that Hayes seemed different from the other miners, more refined in his speech and mannerisms, as though he had received some education. Their second meeting occurred the following week, when Hayes appeared at the Davis cabin to borrow tools. William Davis was away checking his downstream traps, and Thomas was working their claim. Martha Davis invited Hayes inside for coffee, a gesture of hospitality that was common among the scattered residents who depended on each other for survival. Hayes spoke knowledgeably about mining techniques and shared news from other gold camps he claimed to have worked. Margaret listened from the corner where she was mending clothes, occasionally glancing up when Hayes made a particularly interesting observation. Over the subsequent weeks, Hayes found various excuses to visit the Davis cabin. He brought fresh meat from hunting expeditions, offered to help with repairs to their sluice box, and shared stories of his travels throughout the Western Territories. Margaret began to look forward to these visits, finding Hayes more articulate and worldly than the rough miners who comprise most of Deadwood Gulch's population. Martha Davis noted in her journal that Margaret seemed to brighten whenever Hayes appeared, though she also expressed concern about the man's vague background and mysterious success at mining. Thomas Davis harbored no such ambivalence about Silas Hayes. He distrusted the older man instinctively and grew increasingly suspicious of Hayes's frequent visits to their cabin. Thomas had worked claims in California before coming to Dakota Territory, and he possessed enough experience to recognize that Hayes's mining operation produced far more gold than the geology of his claim should have yielded. When Thomas shared these concerns with other miners, he discovered that several of them had noticed similar discrepancies. The tension between Thomas Davis and Silas Hayes came to a head during the final week of September. Thomas had been working late at the family claim when he noticed Hayes moving along the creek bed in the moonlight, carrying what appeared to be a heavy sack. The next morning, Thomas discovered that someone had tampered with his sluice box and removed several ounces of gold dust from their hiding spot beneath a loose floorboard in their cabin. When Thomas confronted Hayes about these suspicions, Hayes denied any wrongdoing, but suggested that Thomas might be careless about securing his valuables. The argument escalated when Thomas accused Hayes of stealing from multiple claims throughout the gulch. Hayes responded that Thomas was a jealous young man who resented another miner's success. Several witnesses observed this exchange, which took place near the makeshift trading post where miners gathered to purchase supplies. The confrontation ended when Hayes walked away, but not before warning Thomas to be more careful about making accusations he could not prove. Margaret Davis found herself caught between her growing attraction to Silas Hayes and loyalty to her brother. She had begun to anticipate Hayes's visits with an eagerness that troubled her, particularly when she noticed how his presence affected the household dynamic. Thomas would become surly and withdrawn whenever Hayes appeared, while her parents grew increasingly uncomfortable with the obvious tension between the two men. Margaret wrote in her personal diary that she felt torn between her family's concerns and her own feelings, though she never specified exactly what those feelings entailed. On October 4th, Thomas Davis spent the evening drinking with several other miners at a tent that served as the Gulch's informal saloon. He spoke openly about his suspicions regarding Silas Hayes, claiming that Hayes was supplementing his mining income by stealing from other claims. Thomas suggested that the miners should confront Hayes collectively and demand that he open his cabin for inspection. Several men agreed that Hayes's success seemed suspicious, but others argued that accusations without proof could lead to violence that would ultimately harm everyone in the settlement. The conversation grew heated as more men joined the discussion. Some miners had noticed unexplained losses from their claims, but had attributed these to the general lawlessness of the region. Others pointed out that Hayes had never been caught in the act of stealing, and that his mining claim appeared to be legitimately worked. Thomas became increasingly agitated as the evening progressed, insisting that Hayes was a thief who would eventually rob every honest miner in the Gulch if allowed to continue his activities. Margaret Davis later told investigators that her brother returned home that night in an angry and intoxicated state. He ranted about Silas Hayes for nearly an hour, claiming that Hayes was not only a thief, but also a dangerous man who should be driven from the settlement. Margaret attempted to calm her brother, but Thomas became even more agitated when she suggested that his accusations might be based on jealousy rather than evidence. The conversation ended abruptly when Thomas accused Margaret of being blinded by her romantic interest in Hayes. The following morning, October 5th, Thomas Davis rose before dawn and announced his intention to confront Hayes directly about the thefts. William Davis attempted to dissuade his son, arguing that such confrontations rarely ended well in places where men carried guns and tempers ran high. Martha Davis pleaded with Thomas to let the matter rest, at least until he could present concrete evidence of wrongdoing. Margaret said nothing, though she appeared distressed by her brother's determination to pursue the matter. Thomas left the cabin carrying his revolver and a small leather pouch containing samples of gold dust from various claims. He had apparently convinced several miners to provide him with specimens that he intended to compare with Hayes's gold, believing that such evidence might prove his theft theory. Margaret watched her brother walk toward Hayes's claim with a sense of foreboding that she could not entirely explain, though she later admitted that she feared violence might result from the confrontation. What happened during the meeting between Thomas Davis and Silas Hayes became a matter of considerable speculation among the residents of Deadwood Gulch. No one witnessed the actual encounter, which apparently took place near Hayes's cabin around mid-morning. Several miners reported hearing raised voices from that direction, followed by a single gunshot approximately 30 minutes later. When concerned residents investigated, they found no sign of either man at Hayes's claim. The search for Thomas Davis began that afternoon when he failed to return home for the midday meal. William Davis organized a group of volunteers who spread out along the creek bed and through the surrounding hills, calling Thomas's name and looking for signs of struggle or disturbance. The search continued until darkness forced the men to return to their cabins, having found no trace of the missing young man. Margaret Davis spent that night in a state of anxious waiting, alternately pacing the cabin floor and sitting by the window, watching for any sign of her brother's return. She later wrote that she experienced a profound sense of dread that went beyond normal worry about a family member's safety. Something about the circumstances of Thomas's disappearance felt fundamentally wrong, though she could not articulate why his absence seemed so ominous. The discovery came at first light on October 6th. Samuel Davis found his brother's body wedged against a fallen log in a shallow section of the creek, roughly a quarter-mile downstream from Hayes's claim. Thomas had been shot once in the chest at close range, and his gold pouch was missing along with his revolver. The leather pouch containing the gold samples had apparently been torn open and emptied, its contents scattered by the creek's current. The men who gathered around Thomas Davis's body that morning faced a difficult situation. There was no formal law enforcement in the Dakota Territory, no coroner to examine the remains, and no established procedure for investigating violent deaths. The miners understood that Thomas had gone to confront Silas Hayes, and that Hayes had subsequently disappeared, but they also recognized that circumstantial evidence might not be sufficient to justify vigilante action, even if they could locate the suspected killer. William Davis demanded immediate action against Hayes, arguing that his son's death could not go unpunished. Several miners supported this position, claiming that allowing a murderer to escape would encourage further violence in the settlement. Others urged caution, pointing out that they did not know exactly what had transpired between Thomas and Hayes, and that rushing to judgment might result in the wrong man being punished. The debate continued throughout the day while Thomas's body was prepared for burial. Margaret Davis observed these discussions with growing distress. She grieved for her brother while simultaneously struggling with conflicted feelings about Silas Hayes. Part of her wanted to believe that Hayes was innocent of Thomas's murder, that some misunderstanding or accident had led to the tragic outcome. Another part of her recognized that Hayes's disappearance immediately following Thomas's death suggested guilt, regardless of what she wanted to believe about the man who had captured her romantic interest. The burial of Thomas Davis took place that evening in a small cemetery that the miners had established on a hill overlooking Deadwood Gulch. William Davis spoke briefly about his son's life and aspirations. while Martha Davis wept quietly beside the grave. Margaret stood apart from her parents, struggling with emotions that she could not fully understand or express. The service was attended by most of the settlement's residents, creating a solemn gathering that underscored the precarious nature of their existence in the remote mining camp. Following the burial, several groups of miners organized search parties to locate Silas Hayes. They scoured the hills surrounding Deadwood Gulch and followed the creek beds for miles in both directions, looking for any sign of the missing man. Some searched caves and abandoned mine shafts, while others rode to neighboring settlements to inquire whether Hayes had been seen traveling through the area. All of these efforts proved fruitless, as Hayes appeared to have vanished completely from the region. As the search continued into its second day, Margaret Davis made a decision that would haunt her family for the remainder of their lives. On the evening of October 6th, she packed a small bag with essential belongings and left her parents' cabin during the hours before dawn. She took only what she could carry easily and left behind a brief note explaining that she could not remain in Deadwood Gulch any longer. The note provided no indication of where she intended to go or why she felt compelled to leave so soon after her brother's death. Martha Davis discovered Margaret's absence when she rose to prepare breakfast on the morning of October 7th. The note was found on Margaret's bed, written in her distinctive handwriting, but containing no details about her plans or destination. William Davis immediately assumed that Margaret had been abducted by Silas Hayes or his associates, leading him to demand that the miners organize a larger and more systematic search effort. Others suggested that Margaret might have left voluntarily, though they could not explain why she would abandon her family during such a difficult time. The discovery that changed everything came later that same morning. Samuel Davis, while searching along a remote section of the creek, found clear evidence that two people had camped overnight in a sheltered grove roughly 3 miles from the settlement. The campsite contained the remains of a small fire, discarded food containers, and most significantly, a piece of fabric torn from a dress that matched the one Margaret had been wearing the previous evening. Footprints in the soft earth suggested that both a man and a woman had been present at the location. This evidence transformed the nature of the search and the settlers' understanding of what had occurred. Rather than pursuing a simple case of kidnapping, the miners now faced the disturbing possibility that Margaret Davis had left Deadwood Gulch willingly, in the company of the man suspected of killing her brother. The implications of such a scenario challenged their assumptions about family loyalty and the bonds that were supposed to unite people against common threats. William Davis refused to accept that his daughter had chosen to leave with Hayes, insisting that she must have been coerced or threatened into accompanying the suspected murderer. He argued that Margaret's grief over Thomas's death had made her vulnerable to manipulation and that Hayes had taken advantage of her emotional state to secure her cooperation. Martha Davis supported her husband's interpretation, claiming that Margaret would never willingly abandon her family or associate with her brother's killer. Other residents of Deadwood Gulch were less certain about Margaret's motivations. Some recalled observing her apparent attraction to Silas Hayes during his visits to the Davis cabin and wondered whether that attraction might have persisted even after Thomas's death. They speculated that Margaret might have convinced herself of Hayes's innocence or that her feelings for him had overcome her loyalty to her family. Such possibilities seemed almost incomprehensible to a community that valued family bonds above nearly all other considerations. The search for Margaret Davis and Silas Hayes continued for another week, but the trail grew cold beyond the campsite Samuel had discovered. No additional evidence was found to indicate which direction they had traveled or whether they had remained together after leaving the immediate vicinity of Deadwood Gulch. The miners eventually abandoned their search efforts and returned to their claims, though the incident continued to generate conversation and speculation throughout the settlement. The impact of Thomas's death and Margaret's disappearance devastated the remaining members of the Davis family. William Davis became increasingly bitter and withdrawn, spending long hours working his claim alone while refusing to discuss either of his lost children. Martha Davis fell into a deep melancholy that affected her ability to maintain their household, and she often spent entire days sitting by the window as though watching for Margaret's return. Samuel, barely 18 years old, found himself responsible for holding the family together while dealing with his own grief and confusion. The mining season was drawing to a close as October progressed, and many of the prospectors began making preparations to leave Deadwood Gulch before winter set in. The Davis family faced the difficult decision of whether to remain in the place where they had lost so much or to abandon their claim and return to Pennsylvania. William Davis was reluctant to leave without learning what had happened to Margaret, but the approaching winter made it dangerous to remain in the remote settlement without adequate supplies and shelter. During the final weeks of October, a traveling merchant arrived in Deadwood Gulch with supplies and news from other mining camps throughout the territory. He mentioned encountering a man and woman traveling together near the Cheyenne River, roughly 50 miles south of the settlement. The description he provided matched Hayes and Margaret reasonably well, though the merchant could not be certain of their identities. The couple had purchased supplies from him, but had provided no names and had seemed anxious to continue their journey without delay. This information prompted William Davis to make one final attempt to locate his daughter. He rode south with 2 other miners, following the route described by the merchant and inquiring at trading posts and way stations along the trail. They found additional evidence that a man and woman matching the descriptions had passed through the area, but the trail eventually disappeared near the Nebraska border. After a week of searching, William Davis was forced to return to Deadwood Gulch empty-handed and demoralized. The Davis family departed the Black Hills in early November, selling their claim and equipment to other miners who planned to continue working through the winter. They loaded their remaining possessions into their wagon and began the long journey back to Pennsylvania, leaving behind not only their dreams of gold wealth, but also any hope of seeing Margaret again. Martha Davis insisted on taking a small wooden cross that marked Thomas's grave, claiming that she wanted some memento of the son who would remain forever in the Dakota Territory. The departure of the Davis family marked the end of active searching for Margaret and Silas Hayes, but their story continued to circulate throughout the mining camps of the region. The tale became embellished with each retelling, transforming from a tragedy involving real people into a cautionary story about the dangers of isolation and the corrupting influence of gold fever. Some versions portrayed Margaret as an innocent victim, while others suggested that she had been complicit in her brother's death from the beginning. Over the following years, occasional reports surfaced of sightings that might have involved Margaret Davis and Silas Hayes. A woman matching Margaret's description was reportedly seen in various frontier towns throughout Nebraska, Colorado, and Wyoming, sometimes in the company of a man who could have been Hayes. None of these sightings were ever confirmed, and they gradually decreased in frequency as the memories of the original incident faded and new tragedies captured public attention. The question of whether Margaret Davis left Deadwood Gulch voluntarily or under coercion remained unanswered, creating a persistent mystery that haunted those who had known her. Her parents went to their graves, believing that she had been kidnapped and possibly killed, while others in the community suspected that her feelings for Hayes had led her to make an unthinkable choice. The truth of her motivations disappeared with her into the vastness of the American frontier. In 1864, a prospector working claims along the Powder River discovered human remains in a remote canyon roughly 100 miles southeast of Deadwood Gulch. The bones were those of a woman, and fragments of cloth found nearby suggested that she had been buried sometime during the 1850s. A small locket found among the remains contained a miniature photograph of a young man who resembled Thomas Davis, leading some to speculate that the body might be that of Margaret Davis. The discovery was reported in several territorial newspapers, and word eventually reached William Davis, who had returned to blacksmithing in Pennsylvania. He traveled west to examine the remains, but could not definitively identify them as those of his daughter. The locket, while similar to one that Margaret had owned, was a common design that could have belonged to any number of women. Without more conclusive evidence, the identity of the woman buried in the canyon remained uncertain. A separate discovery occurred in 1866, when railroad workers grading a route through Wyoming found a small cache of gold coins buried beneath a distinctive rock formation. The coins were of various denominations and appeared to have been hidden for several years. Local speculation suggested that the cache might have belonged to Silas Hayes, particularly given its location along a route that would have been logical for someone fleeing south from the Black Hills region. The gold find prompted renewed interest in the Hayes case, and several former residents of Deadwood Gulch were interviewed by newspaper reporters about their memories of the incident. These interviews revealed discrepancies in the various accounts of what had transpired during the days surrounding Thomas Davis's death and Margaret's disappearance. Some witnesses recalled details that contradicted the memories of others, illustrating how the passage of time and repeated storytelling had altered the facts of the case. Of particular interest was testimony from a miner named Jacob Mills, who claimed that he had observed Margaret Davis and Silas Hayes meeting secretly on several occasions prior to Thomas's death. Mills stated that these meetings had taken place in a grove near the creek, away from the Davis cabin where Margaret's parents might have observed them. He suggested that Margaret and Hayes had developed a romantic relationship that was more advanced than her family had realized. Mills also claimed that he had overheard a conversation between Margaret and Hayes during which they discussed leaving Deadwood Gulch together. According to Mills, this conversation had taken place on October 3rd, one day before Thomas's confrontation with Hayes. If accurate, this testimony suggested that Margaret and Hayes had been planning to leave the settlement before the violent incident that resulted in Thomas's death, raising questions about whether the timing of their departure was coincidental. However, Mills's credibility was questionable due to his reputation for drinking and his tendency to embellish stories for dramatic effect. Other miners who had known him during the Deadwood Gulch period described him as unreliable and prone to fabrication. Additionally, Mills had waited more than 15 years to share this information, claiming that he had remained silent out of respect for the Davis family's grief. The long delay in his testimony made it difficult to verify his claims or to understand why he had chosen to speak publicly about the matter at that particular time. The conflicting accounts of Margaret Davis's relationship with Silas Hayes reflected broader uncertainties about the nature of social relationships in frontier mining communities. The isolation and harsh conditions of such settlements often created intense bonds between individuals, but they also generated suspicions and misunderstandings that could persist for years after the original participants had moved on or died. The absence of formal record-keeping and reliable witnesses made it nearly impossible to reconstruct events accurately, particularly when those events involved emotional relationships and violent crimes. During the 1860s, several other cases involving mysterious disappearances and suspected murders occurred throughout the mining regions of the American West. The combination of transient populations, inadequate law enforcement, and the vast distances between settlements created conditions that allowed criminals to escape justice while leaving their victims' families without closure. The story of Margaret Davis and Silas Hayes became part of this larger pattern of frontier violence and unresolved mysteries. In 1868, a retired Army officer named Colonel William Barrett published a memoir of his experiences in the Dakota Territory during the 1850s. Barrett included a brief chapter about the Davis case, describing it as an example of how the pursuit of gold wealth could destroy families and corrupt individuals who might otherwise have lived respectable lives. His account contained several factual errors and seemed to be based primarily on hearsay rather than direct observation, but it helped to preserve the story for future generations. Barrett's memoir suggested that Margaret Davis had indeed left Deadwood Gulch willingly with Silas Hayes, driven by a combination of romantic infatuation and rebellion against her family's attempts to control her behavior. He portrayed her as a young woman who had been attracted to Hayes's apparent worldliness and financial success, qualities that set him apart from the rough miners who comprised most of the settlement's population. According to Barrett, Margaret had convinced herself that Hayes was innocent of her brother's death and had chosen to trust him rather than her family's warnings. The memoir also included speculation about Hayes's background and motivations. Barrett suggested that Hayes had been involved in criminal activities before arriving in Deadwood Gulch, and that his success at mining had indeed been supplemented by theft from other claims. However, Barrett also proposed that Hayes's relationship with Margaret had been genuine rather than simply a calculated attempt to use her for his own purposes. This interpretation painted both Margaret and Hayes as tragic figures whose choices had led them into a spiral of violence and exile from which they could never return. The publication of Barrett's memoir generated controversy among former residents of Deadwood Gulch who disagreed with his interpretation of events. Several individuals wrote letters to newspapers challenging his account and insisting that Margaret Davis had been an innocent victim rather than a willing participant in her own disappearance. These critics argued that Barrett had not been present during the crucial events and therefore had no basis for his conclusions about Margaret's motivations or Hayes's character. The debate over Margaret's culpability reflected changing attitudes toward women's independence and moral responsibility during the post-Civil War period. Some observers believed that young women were inherently vulnerable to manipulation by unscrupulous men and therefore could not be held accountable for decisions made under emotional duress. Others argued that women possessed the same moral agency as men and should be judged according to the same standards of right and wrong. These broader cultural questions intersected with the specific circumstances of the Davis case to create a persistent fascination with Margaret's story among readers of frontier literature. Her tale became a popular subject for writers of dime novels and magazine stories, who used it as a foundation for increasingly dramatic and romanticized accounts of love and betrayal in the American West. These fictional adaptations bore little resemblance to the actual events, but they helped to ensure that Margaret Davis's name remained familiar to the general public. In 1869, a woman claiming to be Margaret Davis appeared in Denver, Colorado, seeking assistance from local authorities to locate her family in Pennsylvania. The woman, who appeared to be in her late 30s and showed signs of having lived a difficult life, provided details about her childhood and family that seemed consistent with what was known about Margaret Davis. However, she claimed to have no memory of the period between 1850 and 1865, stating that she had suffered from some form of mental illness that had affected her recollection of those years. The woman's story attracted considerable attention from newspaper reporters and curiosity seekers who traveled to Denver to interview her. She described waking up in a small town in New Mexico with no knowledge of how she had arrived there or what had happened to her during the previous 15 years. Local residents of the New Mexico town had found her wandering in a confused state and had cared for her while she slowly recovered her mental faculties. She claimed that her memories of her life before 1850 had gradually returned, but that the intervening years remained completely blank. Attempts to verify the woman's identity proved inconclusive. She bore a physical resemblance to descriptions of Margaret Davis, though 15 years of hard living on the frontier had aged her considerably. She possessed knowledge of details about the Davis family that would have been difficult for an impostor to acquire, yet she could provide no information about Silas Hayes or the circumstances of her departure from Deadwood Gulch. Medical examination revealed evidence of old injuries and malnutrition that suggested a life of hardship, but these findings were consistent with many possible backgrounds. The woman's claims created a sensation in the Denver newspapers and prompted William Davis to travel west to meet her personally. The encounter between the elderly blacksmith and the woman who might have been his daughter was witnessed by several reporters and officials, but their accounts of the meeting varied significantly. Some observers reported that Davis appeared to recognize the woman immediately and embraced her tearfully. Others described a more tentative interaction in which Davis seemed uncertain about her identity. According to the most detailed account, Davis questioned the woman extensively about her childhood memories and family relationships. Her answers demonstrated familiarity with details that only Margaret Davis would have known, including private conversations and family traditions that had never been publicly discussed. However, her inability to recall anything about the crucial period of her disappearance left Davis struggling to accept her claims completely. The woman's story also raised troubling questions about what might have happened to her during the years when her memory was absent. Her physical condition and psychological state suggested that she had endured considerable trauma, possibly including violence or captivity. The possibility that she had been held against her will for more than a decade created sympathy for her situation, while also raising doubts about her earlier relationship with Silas Hayes. After spending several weeks in Denver, the woman who claimed to be Margaret Davis agreed to accompany William Davis back to Pennsylvania. They departed Colorado in late 1869. Traveling by railroad to the eastern states, where Davis hoped to help his possible daughter rebuild her life. The Denver newspapers reported their departure with considerable fanfare, describing it as the resolution of one of the West's most enduring mysteries. However, the story did not end with their arrival in Pennsylvania. Within 6 months, the woman had disappeared again, leaving behind only a brief note thanking William Davis for his kindness, but explaining that she could not continue living a life based on uncertain memories. The note suggested that she feared she might not actually be Margaret Davis, and that maintaining the deception was causing harm to Davis and to herself. The second disappearance devastated William Davis, who had begun to rebuild his life around the belief that his daughter had finally returned to him. He spent the remaining years of his life wondering whether the woman had indeed been Margaret, or whether he had been deceived by someone who had learned enough about his family to impersonate his daughter convincingly. The uncertainty proved more painful than his original grief over Margaret's disappearance, as it forced him to question his own judgment and memory. The woman's identity was never definitively established, and she was never seen again after leaving Pennsylvania. Her brief appearance in Denver became another layer of mystery surrounding the original case, adding questions about mental illness, memory, and identity to the existing uncertainties about love, loyalty, and violence. The proliferation of unanswered questions made it increasingly difficult for anyone to determine what had actually happened during those crucial days in Deadwood Gulch. By the 1870s, the original mining camp where the Davis tragedy had occurred was largely abandoned. The easily accessible gold deposits had been exhausted, and most prospectors had moved on to more promising locations. The cabins and equipment left behind gradually deteriorated under the harsh Dakota weather, leaving few physical traces of the community that had once existed along the creek. Occasionally, travelers passing through the area reported finding remnants of the old settlement, including the small cemetery where Thomas Davis had been buried. However, the wooden markers that had identified individual graves were destroyed by weather and vandalism, making it impossible to locate specific burial sites. The hill that had once overlooked a bustling mining camp became simply another anonymous rise in the vast landscape of the Black Hills region. The story of Margaret Davis and Silas Hayes persisted in the oral traditions of the surrounding area, told and retold by successive generations who added their own interpretations and embellishments to the basic narrative. These folk versions of the tale often differed dramatically from the documented facts, transforming the incident into a morality play about the consequences of greed and passion. Some tellings portrayed Margaret as an innocent victim, while others cast her as a woman whose desires led her family to destruction. During the 1880s, the development of the Transcontinental Railroad and the establishment of more permanent settlements in the Dakota Territory brought increased interest in the region's early history. Local historians attempted to collect and preserve accounts of the gold rush period, including interviews with surviving participants and witnesses. However, the passage of time and the scattered nature of the mining population made it difficult to gather reliable information about specific incidents. One such historian, Professor James Whitman of the Nebraska State University, spent considerable effort investigating the Davis case during the mid-1880s. Whitman interviewed dozens of former miners and their families, seeking to establish a definitive account of what had transpired in Deadwood Gulch. His research revealed the extent to which memories had been altered by time and repeated storytelling, with different witnesses providing contradictory versions of the same events. Whitman's most significant discovery was a collection of letters written by Martha Davis to relatives in Pennsylvania during the months following Margaret's disappearance. These letters, preserved by family members, provided contemporary documentation of the family's emotional state and their understanding of events as they unfolded. The correspondence revealed details about Margaret's relationship with Hayes that had not been previously known, including Martha's growing concern about her daughter's behavior in the weeks before the tragedy. According to Martha Davis's letters, Margaret had become increasingly secretive and moody during September 1850, spending long periods away from the cabin and showing little interest in her usual household responsibilities. Martha had attributed this change to her daughter's adjustment difficulties with frontier life. But in retrospect, she wondered whether Margaret had been meeting secretly with Hayes during this period. The letters also revealed that Margaret had asked her mother several pointed questions about marriage and family loyalty, conversations that had seemed innocuous at the time, but took on darker significance after her disappearance. The letters described the family's desperate search for Margaret and their gradual acceptance that she might never return. Martha Davis wrote extensively about her husband's deteriorating emotional state and her fears about Samuel's ability to cope with the loss of both siblings. She expressed particular anguish about the uncertainty surrounding Margaret's fate, noting that not knowing whether her daughter was alive or dead made it impossible to grieve properly or to find any sense of closure. Professor Whitman's research also uncovered evidence that Silas Hayes had used multiple names during his travels throughout the Western Territories. Records from trading posts and supply stations indicated that a man matching Hayes's description had purchased goods under the names Samuel Henderson, William Morrison, and Jacob Stevens during the period following his departure from Deadwood Gulch. This pattern of aliases suggested that Hayes was experienced in avoiding detection and had probably been involved in criminal activities before arriving in the Black Hills. The use of multiple identities made it nearly impossible to trace Hayes's movements definitively or to establish his background prior to his appearance in Deadwood Gulch. Whitman speculated that Hayes might have been involved in robberies or confidence schemes in other parts of the frontier, using his apparent refinement and education to gain the trust of victims before stealing from them. Such a background would explain both his success at mining and his ability to disappear effectively when the situation in Deadwood Gulch became dangerous. Whitman's investigation concluded that Margaret Davis had most likely left the settlement willingly with Silas Hayes, motivated by a combination of romantic attachment and desire to escape the constraints of frontier family life. However, he also concluded that Hayes had probably manipulated Margaret's feelings for his own purposes and had involved her in his criminal activities either knowingly or unknowingly. The professor suggested that Margaret had become complicit in her brother's death through her relationship with his killer, creating a moral burden that would have made it impossible for her to return to her family. The publication of Whitman's research in 1887 sparked renewed public interest in the Davis case and prompted additional attempts to locate surviving participants or witnesses. However, most of the original residents of Deadwood Gulch had died or moved far from the region, and those who remained were elderly individuals whose memories had been clouded by the passage of nearly 4 decades. The physical evidence from the original incident had long since been lost or destroyed, leaving only written accounts and oral traditions as sources of information. One unexpected development occurred in 1889 when construction workers building a railroad bridge across Deadwood Creek discovered human remains buried in the bank approximately 2 miles downstream from the former mining camp. The bones appeared to be those of a man who had died violently, and fragments of clothing found with the remains suggested that the death had occurred during the 1850s. A corroded pistol found nearby led some observers to speculate that the body might be that of Silas Hayes. The discovery prompted a brief revival of interest in the case, with several newspapers sending reporters to cover the excavation and interview local residents about the possible identification of the remains. However, the bones were too deteriorated to allow for definitive identification, and no personal effects were found that could conclusively link them to Hayes or any other specific individual. The pistol was of a common type used throughout the frontier during the gold rush period, providing no useful clues about its owner. Some observers suggested that the location of the remains supported theories that Hayes had been killed by other miners seeking revenge for Thomas Davis's death or retaliation for his alleged thefts. According to this interpretation, Margaret Davis might have witnessed Hayes's murder and fled in terror, explaining her subsequent disappearance and the later claims of memory loss by the woman in Denver. However, this theory required accepting that Margaret had survived alone in the wilderness for an extended period, which seemed unlikely given her limited experience with frontier survival skills. The railroad construction project also uncovered remnants of several mining claims, including tools, equipment, and personal belongings left behind when the prospectors abandoned the area. Among these artifacts was a small leather journal containing entries written in a feminine hand, though the ink had faded to the point where only fragments of text could be deciphered. The journal appeared to document daily activities and observations about life in the mining camp, but the deteriorated condition of the pages made it impossible to determine who had written the entries or during what time period. Despite extensive efforts to preserve and analyze the journal, experts could extract only scattered words and phrases from the damaged pages. Some of these fragments seemed to reference relationships between miners and their families, while others described the challenges of frontier life. Several entries appeared to discuss concerns about safety and trust, but without more complete text, It was impossible to determine whether these concerns related to the Davis case or to other incidents that had occurred in the settlement. The incomplete nature of these physical discoveries reflected the broader difficulties involved in reconstructing historical events from fragmentary evidence. The harsh conditions of frontier life and the passage of time had erased most traces of the daily experiences of ordinary people, leaving only scattered remnants that could be interpreted in multiple ways. Even when investigators found potentially significant evidence, the deteriorated condition of materials often prevented them from drawing definitive conclusions. As the 19th century drew to a close, the story of Margaret Davis and Silas Hayes had become firmly established in the folklore of the American West. The tale was included in several collections of frontier legends and was frequently cited as an example of the moral challenges faced by families during the gold rush period. However, these popular versions of the story often bore little resemblance to the documented facts, having been transformed through years of retelling into simplified narratives about good and evil. The persistence of interest in the case reflected broader cultural fascinations with questions of female virtue, family loyalty, and frontier justice. Margaret's story resonated with audiences because it combined elements of romance, tragedy, and mystery in ways that challenged conventional assumptions about women's behavior and motivations. The ambiguity surrounding her choices allowed different generations to interpret her actions according to their own values and beliefs about gender roles and moral responsibility. By 1900, most of the original participants in the Davis case had died, taking with them any first-hand knowledge of what had actually occurred during those crucial days in October 1850. The surviving documentary evidence consisted primarily of brief newspaper accounts, official records, and the letters discovered by Professor Whitman, none of which provided complete answers to the questions that had fascinated investigators for decades. The final documented reference to the case appeared in a 1903 memoir written by Samuel Davis, the youngest member of the original family. Samuel, by then in his 70s and living in Pennsylvania, provided his recollections of the tragedy that had destroyed his family when he was barely 18 years old. His account offered a more personal perspective on the events, describing the emotional impact of losing both siblings and watching his parents struggle with grief and uncertainty. Samuel Davis wrote that he had never stopped wondering about Margaret's fate and had continued to hope throughout his life that she might still be alive somewhere in the Western Territories. He described receiving occasional letters from people who claimed to have seen a woman matching Margaret's description, though none of these reports had ever been substantiated. The uncertainty had been one of the most painful aspects of the tragedy, preventing the family from achieving the closure that might have allowed them to heal from their losses. In his memoir, Samuel also provided details about the impact of the incident on the broader community of Deadwood Gulch. He described how the violence and mystery had created an atmosphere of suspicion and fear that had contributed to the settlement's eventual abandonment. Many miners had left the area shortly after the Davis tragedy, unwilling to remain in a place where such events could occur without resolution or justice. Samuel's account supported the theory that Margaret had left voluntarily with Silas Hayes, though he continued to believe that she had been manipulated or coerced into making that decision. He expressed forgiveness for his sister's choices, while maintaining that Hayes bore full responsibility for the tragedy that had befallen their family. Samuel's perspective reflected the complex emotions experienced by those who had loved Margaret while struggling to understand her actions. The memoir also revealed that Samuel had made several attempts during his adult life to locate Margaret or to learn what had happened to her after she left Deadwood Gulch. He had corresponded with law enforcement officials throughout the western states and had traveled to various frontier towns following up on reported sightings. All of these efforts had proved fruitless, but they demonstrated the lasting impact of unresolved grief on the surviving family members. Samuel Davis died in 1905, taking with him the last direct connection to the original events in Deadwood Gulch. His death marked the end of an era in which the Davis case had been a living memory for those who had experienced it personally. Subsequent interest in the story would be based entirely on historical research and speculation, rather than first-hand knowledge of the participants and their motivations. The transformation of the Davis case from contemporary tragedy to historical mystery reflected broader changes in American society and culture during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The frontier period that had shaped the original events was giving way to a more settled and organized society that had difficulty understanding the conditions and pressures that had influenced people's behavior during the gold rush era. Modern investigators approaching the case faced challenges that went beyond the simple passage of time and the loss of physical evidence. The cultural distance between their own era and the 1850s made it difficult to comprehend the psychological and social factors that had shaped Margaret Davis's choices and Silas Hayes's actions. The values and assumptions that had guided behavior in frontier mining communities were often foreign to people living in more civilized circumstances. The enduring fascination with the story suggested that it touched on fundamental questions about human nature and moral responsibility that transcended specific historical periods. The mystery of what had driven Margaret to abandon her family for the man who had killed her brother continued to challenge those who encountered the tale, forcing them to confront uncomfortable possibilities about the power of desire and the complexity of human motivations. As the 20th century progressed, the story of Margaret Davis and Silas Hayes gradually faded from public consciousness, becoming a footnote in the larger history of westward expansion and gold rush settlement. The particular details of their case were absorbed into the general narrative of frontier violence and family tragedy that characterized popular understanding of the period. Yet, the questions raised by their story remained relevant for successive generations, grappling with similar issues of loyalty, love, and moral choice. The case served as a reminder that even in the most extreme circumstances, human beings retain the capacity for decisions that can surprise and disturb those who believe they understand the bonds that unite families and communities. The silence that had settled over Deadwood Gulch by the beginning of the 20th century was more than simply the absence of human activity. It was the silence of secrets that would never be revealed, of questions that would never receive answers, and of lives that had been transformed by choices whose full implications might never be understood by those who had not faced similar circumstances. In the end, the story of Margaret Davis and Silas Hayes became part of the larger mythology of the American frontier, a tale that captured the imagination because it revealed the darker possibilities that lurked beneath the surface of even the most ordinary human relationships. Their tragedy served as a reminder that the pursuit of gold and freedom in the Western Territories carried with it the potential for both redemption and destruction, depending on the choices made by individuals confronting the moral complexities of life on the edge of civilization. The creek that had once echoed with the sounds of mining equipment and human voices continued to flow through the Black Hills, carrying with it the sediment of countless seasons while offering no hint of the dramas that had once played out along its banks. The landscape that had witnessed such profound human tragedy returned to the timeless rhythms of nature, leaving only the wind and the water to remember what had once transpired in that remote corner of the Dakota Territory.